Tonight I just wanted to talk about this story of David kills Goliath. We know that David was used by Saul, wasn't he, in various ways prior to this event, and Saul had various anxieties that he was dealing with and mood swings, and he used to in 1 Samuel 16 verses 23, he said David would take his harp and play it, and this would bring relief to Saul and make him feel better. And so one of the most, I think, significant verses spoken to Samuel by God is in 1 Samuel chapter 16, and we read there in verse 7. You just want to turn over to that. The Lord said to Samuel, "Don't be impressed by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." And this is speaking of Saul. God does not view things the way men does. People look on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart. So we want to have that in our head as we go into this story in chapter 17 tonight. And it's one of those stories that when you're a kid, you probably think it's exciting and probably for all the wrong reasons. And as you get older and you learn about it, you understand it's not only an exciting story, but there's also this powerful message that David is showing and presenting to all those around him. And hopefully that will also tie in tonight with some of your expectations that you've already spoken of. We know that David was a young man, and he was described as a man after God's own heart. And obviously that can be a powerful example for us as well. We can look up to him, we can relate to him, because a lot of us are young people. Well, I still think I am, but there isn't probably anything in our lives that this man David, and ultimately King David, didn't experience. And we know that he wasn't perfect, and he suffered terrible consequences for his mistakes and his actions. But I think that's even more the reason why that makes it more relatable for us to read all about him and learn all about him. So tonight we're starting right back at the beginning pretty much of his life, and here he was as a witness to his God. And it's an example of an example to God's people as we watch this story unfold tonight. Now, one of the most interesting things in this chapter is the actual fight scene, the actual battle that happens between David and Goliath is probably about 20% of the story. The other 80% of the story is preparing us for this confrontation. And more importantly, we see David as a witness for his God in front of the entire nation. This was the future king, but this stage didn't know that. So we see that this troubled King Saul, and he was King Saul. He was leading the people who looked, didn't they? The people looked at him. He was the tallest in the group. He was the strength. They all looked on the outward appearance, and yet they were equally afraid, and they were troubled, all of them, especially King Saul, by this presence of this man called Goliath, this mighty warrior. So just some quick background or history of Israel to this point in the story. We need to step back in time and just consider a few things. We need to understand why people were scared when there was a clear direction and promise of their God being with them if they were faithful. He tells them that so many times, doesn't he? Genesis 12 and verse 3, we know that it goes right back to the promises of Abraham. It's called the Abrahamic covenant, the term for it. Genesis 12 verse 3, it says, "I will bless them that bless you and curse him that curses you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed." So if that was true, and we know it's true, then Goliath was both cursing Israel and her God. Then if God is a promise-keeping God, we would expect Goliath to be cursed by God as well. We then move on in time to Numbers 13 and 14. We have the record of Israel being fearful of of the Canaanites, and then they rebelled against God at Kadesh Barnea. And then there's the story of the 10 spies sent into the land to check out the promised land. Well, there's the 12, but the 10 came back. Remember saying how negative it was, how big the people were, even though the land that they spied out was magnificent. There was this big problem, wasn't this outward appearance of the size of the people that lived in that land. And we see that in Numbers chapter 13. So what causes the Israelites to fear? The size, and it's obviously the size, and by extension, the military strength that was behind these giants who lived in the land of Canaan. We can't go up against the Canaanites, they said. They are giants there because of their fear and their refusal to trust God for victory, the whole generation of Israelites die in the wilderness. And it's not until that second generation of the Israelites come along, is it, that they are ready to live and they're ready to take that land. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 21, do not fear or be dismayed. Deuteronomy 28 verse 7, Yahweh will cause your enemies to rise up against you, but they'll be defeated before you. They shall come out against you one way and flee from you in 7 ways. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 18, Moses speaks to all Israel, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or tremble. God won't fail you or forsake you. He has made you a promise. Do not fear. And then we come to Joshua and Judges, and these books record the many defeats of Israel's enemies. And it wasn't by the strength of themselves or their army. It was made possible through certain individuals, wasn't it? There was Samson and Gideon. And then we come to 1 Samuel. The first 16 chapters are this build up to this battle of David and Goliath. And we can see there's even key verses from 1 Samuel in chapter 2 from Hannah's prayer. Verses chapter 2 and verse 3 and 4 and verses 9 and 10. It talks about our God will handle it. Trust him. If you look in 1 Samuel, I might just read that for you, 1 Samuel chapter 2, and we see in verse 3 and 4, don't go speaking arrogantly, letting proud talk come out of your mouth, for Yahweh is God who knows. He evaluates what people do. The bows of warriors are shattered, but those who stumble find their strength reinforced. So you can see this even back in Hannah's prayer. He talks about don't speak arrogantly, and it's exactly what Goliath was doing. And then 1 Samuel 4, we see the first war against the Philistines, and where they suffer this defeat, thinking if they took the ark to the war, it would, somehow magically bring them. They carry the ark out to save them, and it didn't bring them victory, did it? In 1 Samuel 7, we see the second battle. So there's these battles going on with the Philistines. And then Israel's surrounded and they're defenseless. And if it wasn't for Samuel stepping in or interceding for them, they were once again in trouble. And then in 1 Samuel 8, what do? Well, they ignore everything we have just talked about. They don't trust in God. They want a human king, and one that they can see. They want to be like the other nations. And so this is where King Saul is chosen, a man who stood head and shoulders above his fellow Israelites. That's in chapter 9, 1 Samuel 9, verse 2. This is the man who supposedly was going to deliver God's people from the Philistines. So when we view this confrontation tonight between the Israelites and the Philistines, and the confrontation between David and Goliath, in light of everything that we've just quickly looked at, we can see this very different perspective. Are the Israelites, including Saul, terrorized by Goliath, as we see in 1 Samuel 17? And we know that they are. But they shouldn't be, should they? This fear that they had, including King Saul and also David's brothers, was a fear which is not only something of a lack of faith, but it was also a disobedience to the commands that God had given to his people. Why are they terrified of this giant when they should be saying, well, it's only one giant? Why are they holding back and not attacking? Is it not the size of Goliath or the arrogance, as we saw, of his words that should cause us to wonder, but rather the unbelief and the fear of God's people? The situation wasn't anything new, though. The odds are no worse here than elsewhere. Israel simply once again lacked faith, and Israel lacks godly leadership. So the Philistines, who were they? We first hear of the Philistines when they way back in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 14. It says there, it says the Pathrusites, the Cashlohites, and in brackets there it says from whom the Philistines came. The Cashlohites lived in Crete and eventually settled east of the Egyptian delta between Egypt and the land of Canaan, as it was known. You can see that in the next slide here. So you can see down in that area, the Philistine cities. And then there's a zoomed up area, sorry, just there. So those cities there, you got Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath. So that's Gath was the main city that we deal with tonight. So you can see back, that's in the bottom part of Israel. So these were descendants of people called Casluhim. I'm not really sure how you say that, sorry, but and they were known. The Philistines were known as a seafaring nation who left Crete, and they got on the water and they sailed over and arrived in this land of Canaan. And that was the beginning of the 12th century BC. Now, the Philistines inhabited the Mediterranean coast of Canaan, which you can see there during the period of the Book of Judges, and they established 5 main cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. And we know that Goliath was from Gath in 1 Samuel 17. So they were also highly developed in weapons, and they're a very serious threat to the Israelites. And you probably recall that during the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites purposely took a southern route to avoid them, and then pretty much from then on, the Philistines had these battles with the Israelites. So after their defeat at the hand of David, which we're going to look at in a minute, the Philistines were reduced to mainly commercial sort of ventures, and rather than fighting people. And then throughout the Book of Kings, different Jewish leaders fought the nation until the Assyrians completely defeated them. And then the Philistines basically assimilated into the surrounding cultures, and they basically ceased to exist as a separate nation from that time. So this was it. Tonight's it. The showdown with a long-time enemy of God. And we want to set the scene, don't we? Let's turn to 1 Samuel 17 and verse 1. So the Philistines gathered the troops for battle. They assembled in Succoth in Judah. They camped in Ephes Dammim between Succoth and Azkar. So this is where the valley of Elah is in the whole scheme of Israel today. And I've got a little, you can have a look at that. This is the valley of Elah. You see it runs through the middle there. And we can see on the right-hand side, we've got Saul's camp. This is where they were camped. The highlighted red area is where the Philistines controlled. So they were pushing up north from the south, and they've got to this stalemate. So there's the valley, and then Israel's on the other side of the mountain over there. So Saul and the Israelite army assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, where they arranged their battle lines to fight against the Philistines. The Philistines were standing on one hill and the Israelites on another hill with the valley between them. So you might ask, well, what was stopping the Philistines from charging up and, keep on moving up and attacking? Well, the suggestion is, as you can see on the screen and a couple of photos, in a minute, there's this dog leg in the valley, with a bend in the valley, and there's got the hills on Israel's side. So, and Israel controlled all these hills up here. So even with their big man Goliath, they knew that if they charged up the valley as an army, the Israelis would be able to fight them from the hilly countryside, and also their chariots, which the Philistines had they weren't very good for that sort of terrain, that hillside terrain, and it basically made them useless. So there was this reluctance and this stalemate as they sat in this valley of Elah of who was going to start the fight first, which is why Goliath's offer that he had when he was shouting out to everyone, what seemed to be a good one for both sides. They are smart enough to know that they needed to draw Israel to them, and they needed to use those tactics of fear and intimidation to defeat them. And so we see in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 20. So he says, David arrived at the camp as the army was going out to battle lines, shouting its battle cry. And this had been going on for 40 days. The Goliath yelling and screaming abuse across the valley at Israel. Now, just for some context, I've actually been to the Valley of Elah. And so I just wanted to point out, so I'm standing in this photo, taking this photo, that hill in the distance, that's where the Philistines were. You've got the valley that comes down, and where I'm standing is where the Israelites are. And then just from the other perspective, this is where the Philistines were, and you can look in the valley, and then there's the road, and the Israelites were on that the hill there. So you can see it's not very far at all. It's not like it's a modern day warfare where you can't see anyone. They can definitely see each other across the way. This is full on face-to-face fear, intimidation. And every day they had to march along that valley, stand in front of this so-called champion of Gath, and he screamed abuse at them and their God across the Valley of Elah. And every day Goliath got more confident, didn't he? He got very arrogant, and he got closer and closer each day, and he's baiting them, for them to make the first move. Now, before we go on, it's more, I guess, out of interest. There was interest to me, and it's one of the highlights of the story, I suppose, especially when you're a young boy. The massive warrior giant of this man, Goliath, and he's supposed to have towered above everyone. He gives this appearance off, doesn't he? He was not scared of anything. He had massive muscles. He walked around the valley, kind of one of those people you know what they're like. They turn up to the loud mouth at the party. He was seen out and about by the locals. People wanted to get selfies with him, and he was a celebrity amongst his people. And also, he was now known to, obviously, the Israelites. This man was the absolute symbol of everything the world loves and aims for in their lives, wasn't it? This is what everyone wants to be. And there's no doubt that this man Goliath was the type of person who would be intimidating to most of us. And I just wanted to touch for a moment on the physical size, because it is a key part of the story, because in the end, God doesn't matter what size or height you are, but I think it's just interesting anyway. God, we know, doesn't look on the outward appearance, and obviously Goliath is no match for God. And this is the ultimate, the champion of the world. This is what the best they could offer, and there was no intimidation of God with this man. But his size, just like in other times, was why this Israelite army stood in that stalemate on that hill, waiting for some miracle to be delivered by their king, who was hiding in his tent, basically. So in verses 4 to 7 in 1 Samuel 17, this champion came out from the camp of the Philistines. His name was Goliath. He was from Gath. He was close to, so the net version says he was close to 7 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was wearing scale body armor. The weight of his bronze body armor was 5,000 shekels. He had bronze shin pads, shin guards on his legs, and a bronze javelin was slung over his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer was walking before him. So, so there's a lot of weight there in this description that we see in these verses, isn't it? In the end, I don't want to be too pedantic. We could always just say, yeah, he was a big guy, and that's the point. So keep that in mind. But when you're growing up and you're in Sunday school and the lessons were taught, I clearly remember for years, you know, the height was put up in our Sunday school. This is how high he was. Now, if you take the King James version of the Bible, it describes a man who is 297 centimeters tall, so nearly 3 meters tall, which is huge. There are, however, some problems with that height. I'll add a little bit. So the problems with 297 centimeters, which the King James version talks about, no man in history is known to have grown to anything near this height. Those who have grown past 243 centimeters have suffered various conditions that make them weak and unathletic. So you can hardly see a champion of Gath that we have got presented for us tonight. And then the tallest man in history was Robert Wadlow. He reached 271 centimeters, and he had heaps of medical issues due to his height, and he required leg braces to help him walk. And he eventually lost feeling in his feet, and he died at the age of 22. So a lot of the commentaries, including the Net Bible that I've just read from, they read 4 cubits in a span, or 205 centimeters. So I know it's nearly a meter less. The revised size, however, is not a small person. He would also be a bit more realistic version of a massive man who was trained as a fearsome warrior. So we've got this man who's 205 centimeters, and that's what a lot of commentary talk about. Just some more facts about the sizing of the champion there, which is I'll leave on the screen anyway. So just in comparison to the research shows that back in the Bible times and this time of Israel, the average male height was 167 to 170 centimeters tall. So I've tried to put that on a sort of a height graph for you. So you can see and there's an average male height in 2020, which is 179 centimeters. You got an average male height in Goliath's day. So you can, and then compare that to Goliath's height of 205. And then I've put the current tallest man and the tallest man ever on the right hand of that screen there. So not only was he very tall, he was also extremely strong. And you can see that with that description of all that equipment that he read. And now there's also a bit of debate on the exact weight, but it's obviously quite heavy. Some people say it's about 100 kilos of armor that he had on. Another commentator said it's about 57 kilos. So somewhere between that is something, if you can imagine trying to carry that sort of weight. Out of the interest, I looked up what Australian soldiers carry. They carry 58 kilos in their backpack. So if we all think we're strong, you should give that a go later. Try and lift 60 kilos at least on your back. And you can see that he was a formidable warrior, and he certainly was a big and strong person. So the whole point of that is, yes, it's very interesting, but he was big and strong in the sight of the army, and they had these stars in their eyes of this person that was around him, and there was fear in the army of Israel, except for there was one young man who turned up to the camp, and his name was David. So unlike Goliath, the Philistine champion, who's described as we've just seen, David, Goliath's opponent, is introduced to us in verses 12 to 15, and it's a very different description. It says in verse 12, now David was the son of this Ephrathite named Jesse from Bethlehem in Judah. He had 8 sons, and in Saul's days he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. So the 3 boys had gone to the war, which is why David was going up there to drop the food to them. The names of the 3 sons who went to war, it was Eliab, his firstborn, which is important to know for a little point later on. Abinadab the second, and Shammah the third. Now David was the youngest, while the 3 eldest sons followed Saul. David was going back and forward from Saul in order to care for his father's sheep in Bethlehem. So there's nothing here that says, this talks about David's height or his strength or any of the weapons that he used to use. We are simply told that he was the youngest of the 8 sons of Jesse, and he looked after some sheep. So why all this family reference and emphasis describing David when Goliath is described in terms of awesome looks, weapons, and aggressiveness? Well, I think there's several reasons for that. First, it's not David's appearance which causes God to choose him. God chooses him, doesn't he, for his heart and his character, something the children of Israel really misunderstood and were currently is being demonstrated by the fear that they had. The second point is, in order for David to be recognized as the one whose offspring would someday be Jesus, the Messiah, he must be of the tribe of Judah, and he must be a Bethlehemite. Him being the youngest in the family explains why he's assigned to care for the sheep, and also why his father sends him to deliver food to his brothers and to bring back the report of how they were going. And the third point is, and probably the most significant point to note, is it's another example of how God reverses what man's ideals and aims in life are. Usually they would choose the oldest son of Jesse, not the youngest. And so here we see David, the youngest, being chosen by God. And so we see David get sent by his father up to the battle line. And there's a very clear contrast between the way Goliath comes to do battle with David and the way David finds himself facing Goliath. We see that Goliath's role is predictable, even expected. He's a seasoned soldier, he's arrogant, he's a champion whose role is to fight. And David comes into this fight in a very different way. We would never expect it, and probably David wouldn't either. He's not even in the army, is he? The 3 eldest brothers are. But then there are 4 other brothers older than David who are not fighting either. David is the youngest of the 8 sons, and his job is to play the harp for Saul and to care for his dad's sheep. So who could have ever imagined that he would end up accepting Goliath's challenge? So how does David end up on the battlefield? Well, he arrives on the scene, doesn't he? Because it wasn't the result of his own initiative, because he's busy caring for his father's sheep. But David's brothers, oldest brothers, are fighting. And it's been some time since their dad, Jesse, had received any report about how they were going. What were they like? What was the welfare? And so due to his old age, Jesse, he couldn't travel the distance. So he tells David, go up to the camp and take some supplies to his brothers and to their commanders. And that's in verse 17 and 18. And I'm sure in the mind of Jesse, he doesn't want to put his youngest son in harm's way. And he would never have thought that David would arrive while the soldiers are in the camp he would arrive and the soldiers were there in that camp. Remember, we saw that on the right-hand side and they marched down every day. He didn't think David was going to arrive at the battle line. And it simply doesn't work out that way because God has very different plans, doesn't he? And these events are arranged, obviously, by God so that a very different outcome happens. So David arrives just as the Israelite soldiers, they're going out for their marching towards the battle line. And they give this big battle cry as they go and they march and they approach, don't they? But they don't get too close. And especially that Goliath champion of Gath. So David there, he decides, well, he puts the food down with someone back at the camp and he decides to follow his brothers to the battle line. And there David finds his brothers, and it's at this moment, as he's talking with them, Goliath steps forward and he repeats the challenge for about the 81st time. Goliath says what he always does, but this is the first time David has ever heard it. So David listens to this giant's challenge, doesn't he? And he's cursing Israel and he's cursing God. And he watches as the frightened Israelites, they retreat back. They draw back, don't they? And they're supposed to be warriors. Their courage was shattered by this man's words and his appearance. And some of the Israelites talk to David and tell him that the king Saul has issued for a volunteer to fight Goliath. And there's going to be a big reward for the man who does step up to that challenge. He's going to have substantial amount of wealth given to them, one of his daughters for a wife, and he promises to exempt the volunteer's family from taxes. And there was a possibility these offers were getting more each day, and yet still no one was interested. No one was interested, in fighting, even though these rewards were increasing. David, on the other hand, he's amazed, isn't he? He can't believe that no one took the chance to jump. He thought it was a privilege to fight Goliath. After all, David thought, well, this man here is cursing the people of God and therefore cursing God himself. And then we see David's little exchange with his eldest brother, the firstborn, Eliab. And that happens in verses 28 to 30. When David's oldest brother Eliab heard him speaking to the men, he became angry with David and said, "Why have you come down here? To whom did you entrust these few sheep in the desert? I am familiar with your pride and deceit. You have come down here to watch the battle." David replied, "What have I done now? Can't I say anything?" Then he turned from those who were nearby to someone else and asked him the same question, but they gave him the same answer as before. Goliath wasn't the only obstacle in this whole story, was it? The first is David's circumstances. He's young. He's not even in the army. He's a shepherd boy. Besides Goliath, David must also get past his older brother, Eliab, and Saul. So he asked to obtain official permission to engage Goliath on the battlefield. So the first obstacle is in the process of being removed. Now, David is dealing with the second obstacle, which is his older brother, Eliab, in verses 28 and 30. We see this tense little exchange between the brothers, and you can imagine this as an older brother, little brothers, and his eyes roll. And Eliab accuses him, doesn't he? He said, he's the eldest. Jesse. It must have. Remember when Samuel went to anoint him? They saw him. He might have been the handsome one because Samuel expects that he's going to be the one that's the king of Israel. But Eliab is rejected along with all the other brothers because God doesn't choose on the outward appearance, but on the basis of having a heart after his own heart. Eliab here does not have the heart that David does. And furthermore, Samuel anointed David before his brothers. So Eliab knows about God's selection of David as king. And so by the end of chapter 17, Eliab does not come out looking very good at all. And when he hears David inquiring of the other soldiers about the rewards Saul has offered to the man who defeats Goliath, Eliab is angry, and he proceeds to accuse him, and he vents that anger towards David. You've come to the battlefield for all the wrong reasons. You just want to watch it. You want to be a spectator at this battlefront for your own entertainment. Eliab doesn't know that he either doesn't know that David has come in obedience to his dad's instructions, or he's just put this aside. And then he attacks David, accusing him for forsaking his responsibilities and abandoning the flock, and adds insult to the injury by saying, oh, you just look after a few sheep. Your task is only small. You just take, you just look after sheep. It's just trivial, just a few. In fact, David had not neglected his flock at all, but he'd got someone else to care for them while he was away. Worst of all, Eliab dares to judge his youngest brother's heart, accusing him of acting out of a wicked heart. And it's ironic that in every area Eliab accuses David, his youngest brother is not only innocent, but commendable. Running through all the accusations is one main theme: David's youth. David is accused of coming to the battle scene out of childish curiosity, and it's so wrong. He's accused of, forsaking his responsibilities as a child is inclined to do. And he's also accused of insolence and wickedness of heart, of which children are capable. How dare David come and raise questions about Saul's request and Goliath's challenge? If David had gone home right then and there and given his father a complete and honest report about the war and the conduct of his older brothers, what was he going to tell Jesse? He probably would have reported back that there was no progress had been made in defeating the Philistines, that his brothers had all run like cowards when Goliath approached. He would have to tell his father that when he brought up the subject of volunteering to fight Goliath, he was severely cut down by his oldest brother. It's also interesting that Goliath's arrogance and blasphemies are minimized by Eliab, while David is falsely accused of wickedness for doing and speaking what was right. David may have been disappointed and distressed by his oldest brother's unkind words or of condemnation, but he definitely doesn't stop him, does it? If Eliab had his way, David would have been sent away in shame. But fortunately for Israel, David is neither devastated nor deterred by Eliab's sarcastic rebuke, which he attempts to cut down David. Eliab may have ordered that David go home if Saul had not gotten word about David's interest in this, incentive program for taking on Goliath. And so Saul summons David, doesn't he? The first words to his king are gracious and encouraging. Verse 32. David says to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." While the application of David's words goes beyond Saul, it really focuses on Saul, who he's obviously scared by the presence of Goliath and this big army that he had. But David says to Saul, "Don't fear." And the reason David can say this is because he's willing. I will go and fight Goliath. It's interesting to compare between the faith of Saul and David, isn't it? And it's something that we can have in our lives today. What faith do we have, Saul or David? You can conclude that by nature, Saul is less courageous. His father was a mighty man of valor, but this was never said of Saul. Saul was the one they found hiding amongst the baggage when he was supposed to be anointed as Israel's king. When the Spirit comes on Saul, he becomes a new man with a new heart. But David seems to be a man after God's own heart before the Spirit comes upon him. So when faced with this Philistine opposition, Saul is passive. He's not aggressive. Though fighting the Philistines is a significant part of his calling, is what he's supposed to do as a king. Only when the Spirit comes upon Saul mightily does he seem to act decisively against his enemies. And you see that in chapter 11, verse 6. So by nature, Saul is less courageous. Only in the Spirit is he a true leader. But having said all of this, we should admit to feeling some compassion maybe, or pity for Saul. In many ways, his refusal to fight Goliath is probably understandable. What had Saul been told previously? Saul had been told that his kingdom is as good as finished. Samuel leaves him and said he never sees his face again. The Spirit of God departed from him, replaced by an evil spirit from the Lord. I don't think I would be doing anything dangerous or courageous either if those were the things that I had in my mind. David is a man of courage, and at this point, the only Israelite on the battlefield with courage. Where does he get his courage from? Well, David's courage grows out of his understanding of God. David is a man after God's own heart. David knows God. David acts like the king of Israel should act. He needs to trust in God. He needs that to inspire his fellow Israelites to do likewise and to defeat the enemies of God, especially the Philistines. This was the arena to do that. Everyone was watching. This young man is not a soldier, and some would say he is too young to fight. But David is placed in a circumstance where he must trust God and obey his word, or be like the rest of them, hiding in their tent on the hill. Saul gives him every opportunity, doesn't he, to excuse himself, go back to his father, go back to the sheep. There's no guilt or shame in doing that. And there's certain kindness in Saul's words to David when he attempts to talk him out of fighting Goliath. Saul does not say that David is too small to fight Goliath, but that he is too young and therefore inexperienced. How can he compare to Goliath, the seasoned champion with years of combat experience behind him? David is just a young boy in his eyes with no combat missions at all. But David convinces Saul, doesn't he? Just let me go. Allow me to represent Israel and my God in fighting Goliath. Eliab was obviously never more wrong about David. David compares, doesn't he, situation to situations he's already faced as a shepherd boy. Goliath, yeah, he's strong and mighty, but so are lions and bears. And I've faced those and I've killed them when I was looking after the sheep. Is Goliath an arrogant loudmouth? Well, few creatures on earth are more intimidating than a roaring lion or a bear chasing after you. And here David has killed both lions and bears. He wasn't scared. And Goliath was definitely not a new threat to David. And so Saul gives David permission to fight Goliath and offers him his armor. And the armor is a bad idea, and David doesn't want anything to do with it. But it does strongly imply that David is fighting Goliath in Saul's place as the official representative. So this is what Saul should be doing, leading the Israelite army. And Saul's taking that armor and trying to put it on David because he's now the representative of the Israelite army. If this is the case, then David's victory should be Israel's victory, which it proves to be. On the flip side of that, David's defeat will appear to be Israel's defeat, at least by the terms that Goliath lays down. David knows he's not fighting this battle alone. He's fighting it for God. It's for Saul. He's fighting it for the whole entire nation of Israel. David is going against Goliath with the same weapons he had used before. with those that God had given him the skill to use. And so we come to this battle in verses 40 to 54. We see this battle commence. Here is a man whose ego seems as large as he is. He's arrogant, he's proud, he comes out, he challenges, doesn't he? Send me a warrior. The winner takes all. And can you imagine the shock of Goliath and his ego when David comes out of this crowd? Here is a young man with no armor, nothing to attack him with. But he does notice that David is carrying a sling and he hasn't placed a rock in it yet. So he doesn't really seem that threatening to him. What Goliath does see is the stick that David carries in his hand. Goliath seems to jump to the conclusion that this is David's only weapon. People carry sticks even today to ward, to get rid of dogs that might chase them. And Goliath utters curses and curses him, doesn't he, by his gods. Goliath's outraged that, well, I'm going to kill you, David. And I'm going to feed your carcass to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Does that scare David, though? Well, it doesn't, does it? Because all it does is remind David of the promise God made regarding his enemies in verse 46. This very day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head. This day I will give the corpses of the Philistine army to the birds of the sky and the wild animals of the land. And all the land will realize that Israel has a God. It's not David's carcass, is it, that's going to become bird food that day? It's going to be Goliath. David makes it very clear, doesn't he, that this is a contest with his contest with Goliath is not merely a personal matter. David is fighting Goliath for the glory of God and behalf of the nation of Israel. And his victory should be a lesson to all that the battle is the Lord's as well as the victory. David doesn't wait for Goliath to come to him. Instead, he runs towards Goliath, doesn't he? He takes out one of those 5 stones as he runs. He places it in the sling and he swings it. And as it heads towards the giant, David's target is the only spot without armor. He hits a dead center, doesn't he? The stone sinks deeply into the skull of Goliath and it brings him down like a falling tree. David runs to Goliath and he pulls out his sword from the motionless body and he hacks off his head. The enemy is now bird food. Imagine this moment of silence across the valley. It must have been one agonizing moment in time when the whole world seemed to stand still and to keep silent. The Philistines were paralyzed for that one moment, minds racing to take in what had just happened before their eyes. They begin to realize the implications of what's just happened. The same was probably also true, and it was also true for the Israelite soldiers. And then all chaos breaks loose. The Philistines, they take off, they turn, and they run. The loss of their champion, all the courage and the will to fight are gone. And the Israelite soldiers, they seize that moment, don't they? And they take off after that retreating enemy. There's no better place from which to fight an enemy than from behind, where there's no armor to protect and the sheer weight of their armor hinders their retreat. Bodies of the slain Philistines are strewn from the battle site to the very gates of their cities, wasn't it? And on the way back, the Israelite soldiers are laden. They got all these treasures and that they've taken from the Philistine camps. There is something as we come to a close in verses 55 to 58, which should bother us. It's not Saul's faulty memory, but he seems to be detached from the battle. David has just spoken with Saul, and he's gone out to battle with Goliath. And then Saul and his commander-in-chief, they watch from a distant vantage point, don't they? If anyone should be getting ready for the battle, it would be these two men. Saul is the one whose duty is to go before the Israelites to battle. Abner the commander of the army, is also to lead in the battle. Yet these two men seem to look on, don't they, from a safe distance, while David goes out, the shepherd boy, to risk his life. Here they are, Saul and Abner, sitting back at this safe distance. They're chatting about the name of David's father. Abner tells Saul he doesn't know. And then David returns from killing Goliath. Abner brings David to Saul with Goliath's head in his hands. Saul then asks David whose son is he, and he's told that his father's name is Jesse, the Bethlehemite. It's almost a bizarre situation. What about the battle? Why is Saul and Abner not in the thick of that battle? How do they find the time to talk about such things as the name of David's father at a time like this? Saul is not portrayed in a very favourable light, and it's fairly clear why God rejected him as a king. We're told that David thought in his heart when Samuel anointed him as Israel's next king, Saul's replacement. We're told what David thought in his heart. David likewise must have thought, how can I possibly be Israel's king when I'm just a young man? I'm not even old enough to be in the army, and the only authority I have is over the small bunch of sheep that I look after. Chapter 17 is a significant part of the plan to make David king. I think it's really wonderful how God goes about accomplishing his word. And what God promises, God provides. His word is sure, and that's an encouragement it should be to all of us. The story we've seen tonight has much to teach us about leadership, how it is developed, how it is recognized. By birth order and family circumstances, David does not appear destined for leadership, but he is a man after God's own heart. David learns to trust God, to use the weapons that he's been given, a lesson for us all as well. David doesn't seek leadership. In a sense, it's thrust upon him. David became this leader by being a good follower. God is capable of delivering his people any way he chooses. And in the case of Goliath, God used a young man and a sling. These may not be impressive weapons in and of themselves, but David and his sling made a big impression on Goliath. The Apostle Paul picks up and uses the idea of warfare, doesn't he? Put on the armor of God, putting on that armor of God to protect yourself against the world. And it's like a battle every day for those who believe in God. The in-your-face Philistine that is presented to us is probably not one of fear or intimidation, but it's in-your-face sin and temptation and a total disregard for our God in our society. This is what upset David the most and each day. And as we all maybe wake up to the alarm in the morning, you put that battle armor on just like they did. We go into the world. How do we react? Is the lesson for us. Does it upset us as we see this symbol of Goliath in our face? And what do we do to defend our God in the face of these attacks? In each case, we must remember that the battle is the Lord's. It is he who goes before us, giving us the victory. Thank you.